All right. So welcome to MoveSKILL. I'm going to do a bi-monthly group chat / question and answer session. Might be a little bit of ranting going on as we go, and this will be recorded, stuck up on the internet for those folks that can't join us at exactly the time I do it. And we've had some good questions shot at us the last few days since we announced this thing. So thought I would tackle those questions first. Tackle any ones that happen to pop up if someone's listening and you want to, in the chat box there, type in a question, shoot that at me, or save it for next time. And then I have a little bit of a spiel about how and why to properly set your shoulders and what that's all about, and how that can help or hurt training. I'm going to go into that for a little bit. So again, if you have questions, just text them at me here, and otherwise I'll get going. So Mark wrote, first question I'm going to tackle is from Mark: how to increase range of motion in the lower part of the squat? And a related part of that question, how to improve hip spine mobility to squat as deep as possible without getting the butt wink. And I'll kind of correct. I don't know. I'm going to tackle that in a couple different things. First of all, hip mobility we want. Spine mobility in context of squatting correctly, we don't want. The job of the spine when it's under a load is, for the most part, is to be stable. And by stable, we're talking about anatomically neutral. So butt wink is where your pelvis rolls under, your butt tucks at the bottom of the squat. Classic example is some tradesperson squatting down to do a job, and we all get an unfortunate view. That's the hips rolling again under, or if you stood up and did that same motion, your hips would be tucking. Imagine your pelvis as a bowl, and we're tilting the bowl backwards, right? So it's called posterior pelvic tilt, and that's butt wink, a little more technical term, posterior pelvic tilt. And if you stood up and did this, just maybe stand up, put your hands on your hips, both hands, one hand on each hip, and then just tuck your tail or tilt your pelvis backwards. That's posterior pelvic tilt. Normally there's no reason to do that standing up, but this is a good way to feel it. That comes together with rounding your lumbar spine, right? Your spine has to move so that the pelvis can move, and that we don't want that, obviously. So we don't want mobility in the spine in this context. Some other contexts like tumbling, rolling, moving with usually dynamic movements, but no load, very little load. Imagine a gymnast tumbling through the air. There's no real load on them, they're tumbling. Then when it's time to land, they're snap back to a neutral position, stick the landing, right? Or we could do the same thing skiing. You may be in a tight little tuck, and you fly through the air, and you need to come out of that tuck a little and be neutral, spine neutral, as you skis touch down on the snow and you stick the landing. So if the spine's not mobile, it's stable in a neutral position, then the mobility needs to come from the hip. So Mark, your question really is more about, how do I get enough hip mobility that you don't have to round your spine / tuck your tail? And the short answer to that is, one, be aware of the problem, right? So know what position you're trying to hold, and practice that. So the way that plays out in a squat, let's take a loaded, like a high bar back squat. get under the bar, stand up, step out of the rack, pressurize, turn on your hip engagement, start pulling yourself down in a squat. As you're beginning the squat motion, you have already taken a big breath, squeezed your abs, and braced your whole trunk hard. So the trunk then is locked into shape. And in order for the butt wink to happen at the bottom, you have to let some of that pressure go. You have to allow your abs and allow those muscles to relax, release a little so that you can, we're essentially relaxing to get to the bottom of the squat. So the first thing we do is stop that. Don't relax, because here's what happens. As you get down to the last few inches of the squat, if you relax your muscles and allow your spine flexibility or spine mobility to take you the last couple inches of the squat, you're no longer asking your hips to do that. And so they don't. So now you can squat this way. And besides putting your spine at risk, you're not actually challenging your hips to increase their mobility. So what we want is the hips to move, hips, knees, ankles, all that stuff to move so that we can get to the bottom of the squat and maintain neutral spine. You start by maintaining neutral spine, right? And then from that, now the bottom of the squat, the first thing that happens is you can't get down quite as far, right? Which is why you did it in the first place. But now you're actually challenging your hip mobility, right? So you stay engaged, don't let the spine go, don't let your trunk go. And now you're hitting the limit in your hips, and the hips are what's being asked to change. So if you're strict about that, and then you get down, diligently get down to that bottom position as often as you can in training, you will improve it. So the bottom of the squat itself becomes a loaded stretch. There's some other things you can do, just a real quick, throw out some ideas. Often ankles, tight ankles are what actually is holding people back at the very bottom. In order for everything to drop into place, your ankles need to flex some so that the shins and knees can come forward so you can actually get down there. We don't usually think about ankles much because they just do their jobs, but tight ankles actually restrict. One way to test for that is elevate your heels on like some weights, a plate, a board. Elevate your heels a little bit, and if that improves your squat position, it's tight ankles, right? So now we can do some calf raises, some ankle stretching, stuff like that. There are also other hip mobility drills, quad stretches and hamstring stretches and Cossack squat stretches, and all of the hip mobility is going to help. But the real answer is to be strict about how that squat is happening. So if let's see, I just got a text to repeat the last three sentences, but I'm trying to remember which three of those were.
Sorry, that was me. It's just when you went on saying you have to keep the hips engaged and not allow the trunk to give in, to relax. That's really the part where I think I missed.
It's so common. Like I see this every single day in my practice. It's normal. In a way, it's a really practical kind of expedient thing to do. Relax through the bottom of the stretch. Relax through the bottom of the squat. Kind of let go a little and almost bounce at the bottom. Or at the very least, let go a little to get the last few inches. And doing that guarantees that you won't make any improvement in this. Because when you buy that last few inches of motion with your spine, you're not asking your hips to do their job, right? So simple, not easy, but simple. Keep your spine, trunk stable, strong, tight, neutral. And pull yourself down until you hit the limits in your hips and work on those limits. Like it's a moment at the bottom of each squat, and that is in fact a loaded stretch. So that's really the secret, and this is kind of where I wanted to go today with my talk about shoulders. The secret to squatting well is to be strict with how that's happening. Let's see, there was another question from Mark about how to think about some exercises for a right shoulder issue. Let me come back to that one in a little bit, because I want to talk about shoulders a lot today. But then I had some questions from Reghard. Kind of this, it's related. I recently finished 2017 cycle 4 of the performance program. The cycle ended with a tremendous amount of squats. 8 of the last 10 days featured some form of squats, either high volume or high intensity. And my knees have started to ache, and I'd appreciate some advice on how to prevent that in the future. So this is related. It's a different issue on the surface, but ruling out some injury, assuming that Reghard is doing some foam rolling and some stretching and doing some things to maintain and take care of his quads, almost certainly what's happening. And in fact, I'm going to shoot Reghard an email and ask him to send me a video, because without even seeing, I'm almost certain that he's squatting with his knees moving forward too much. It might just be a little bit, it might be a lot, but kind of the other form of I don't know, squatting problems take a couple of major themes, and one of them is this whole letting go / failing to stabilize the spine. The other one is being way too quad dominant. Squat motion is a quad dominant movement, but the first thing that should happen when we start to squat, after you get set, you've got your stance set, you've got your shoulders engaged, you take a big breath, you squeeze your abs hard, you start pulling yourself down. That first motion, and by pulling I mean actively pulling the hips back and down, and the first visible motion needs to be the hips moving back, which immediately puts your weight on your heels, or at least toward the back third of your foot, which is where your weight needs to stay through the duration of the movement. And even, or like we just discussed, especially if that limits your depth, if the knees come forward too early or too far, that's going to end up putting more than optimal load on the quads, and therefore on the patellar tendon, and it's going to cause problems with knee pain. In my experience, almost all of this exercise-caused knee pain can be fixed by looking at the squat technique and fixing that. A really simple takeaway from this, and I actually plan to do a video treatment of this, but a really simple takeaway right now is, again, after you set up, as you start to move in a squat motion, this is true in front squats as well, as you start to move, the weight needs to be at least in the back third of the foot, if not all the way in your heels. It needs to stay there throughout, including at the bottom. All right, so as we run into tissue tightness, so this comes back now again to the first question, a combination of weak glutes or hamstrings, and by weak, it doesn't have to mean weak as a kitten. It just means that that's the weakest part of you, right? So if you're sitting back and your hamstrings are starting to become weaker than your quads in that position, your quads will just try to take over. And what that looks like is the knees come forward a little bit, and you feel it as weight shifts towards the front of your foot. If you're coming up on the balls of your foot at all, squatting, that alone will explain knee pain. Sometimes we can get some ankle mobility issues that also cause some knee pain. So I'm going to circle back to that in another talk another day, but for right now, it wasn't the volume or intensity of the squattings in the last cycle that caused Reghard's knee pain. I'm almost dead certain, and I have to throw that little qualifier because I haven't actually seen this movement yet on him, but almost dead certain that the squat technique is off. And that's a nice segue to, again, the point I wanted to talk about today about shoulders. If we're training and it's causing some kind of a chronic problem or a recurring problem, we're doing something wrong, right? If I'm trying to work through say a muscle up cycle or a dip cycle or a pull up cycle or whatever, anything, and my elbow starts to hurt, I've got a technique issue. It might be some relative weakness. It might be my shoulder moving when it's not supposed to. There's a number of things it can be, but I'm doing something wrong, right? And again, as a exercise or training related issue, right? So if you bang your elbow on a corner, then that's not mysterious. That's why that hurts. But it's a really good rule of thumb. If we're causing some pain or trouble with recurring exercise, then it's a technique problem. So for now, let's say two quad dominant on that squat. A related question from Regard. I started MoveSKILL in January and I've seen great improvements. I've played with 3 sessions a week, 4, 5, and 6. I'd like to hear your thoughts on frequency of training. Short answer, 3 to 5 days a week. Longer answer is it all depends on recovery, and that depends on your life. How old, what's the rest of your days like? Do you get enough sleep? How do you eat? This is a big part about taking steroids. Not that I'm encouraging that at all, but steroids, just injecting some steroids by themselves don't make anybody more muscular. What they do is allow people to train more frequently, right, at a big expense. But normal folks with lives, with jobs, you really have to learn to gauge how you recover, and that's just down to how you feel and how training goes. You're going to have up days and down days, obviously. We can't have too many down days, or you start to suspect that you're overdoing it, right? If you're failing to make progress, or you're just feeling like you got run over by a truck all the time, back off, right? And what I've found the typical adult can handle, so let's say anyone from late 20s into their 50s, again, depending on how they live their lives, 3 to 5 days a week. 3 days a week is enough to make slow but consistent progress. And for a lot of people, that's about as good as it gets, right? Realistically, we all want more, but realistically, 5 days a week for most folks, regular working folks, 5 days a week is pretty much all anybody can recover from. You start pushing 6 days a week. You can do that short term if everything's else is managed really well in your life, but you got to be careful even with 5 days a week, right? So I think a practical thing to do is try 3, if that's good. Try 4, if that's good. Maybe consider adding a 5th, and consider kind of dropping in and out of that 5th is a good way to do it. One other thought on that, back to our first couple questions. One great way to judge in a workout whether or not things are going the way you want is by your ability to hold technique. So back to that butt wink question. If you're really working hard to maintain your neutral spine, and set up a camera and look at it, or get a training partner, set up your phone to video it, or get a training partner to look at you and give you feedback. If your spine is moving at all in spite of your best efforts, either load's too heavy, or you're just getting tired that day and it's time to back off. Or say you're feeling fresh, the load's not too heavy, and you're just trying and you just can't hold it that day. Just probably better do a good warm up and then go home and call that day good, right? So this really becomes paying attention to the details of our technique is really a nice tool to decide day to day. Should I train harder? Should I back off? Should I go home? Like that. So 3 to 5 is the short answer. It depends is the long answer. Let me talk about shoulders some here. I'm going to do a screen share. Let's see, I want to turn on some slides here. So let's see, I'll try to see if I can see chat too. So if there's some issues here, maybe let me know. Mark, can you see that? Do you know?
Yes, I see your, there's a skeleton.
Skeleton, great, okay. Okay, I'm just gonna run through some ideas here. This relates to your shoulder question and just shoulder issues in general. Thing to notice here, the scapula, the shoulder blades are floating, right? There's one bony attachment up here, if you can see my mouse wiggling right here, the clavicle comes across, and there's this AC joint, this acromion clavicular joint there. It's joined together with some tendons in a real living human, but that's, as you can tell, that bone is small, and it's not really transmitting any load. It's a pivot point. It just kind of helps locate things. So looking, let's see from the back here. Let me see. Get my controls going. There we go. So here's the shoulder blade without the rib cage in the way. Just take that out. Shoulder blade's floating. Thing to notice here is that the shoulder socket and ball, the ball is big, and that socket is quite small relative. Here is the same view from the back. Now looking at you see the spine of the scapula. If you reach over your shoulder and kind of run your fingers along that bony ridge in your shoulder blade, you'll feel just that bony ridge right there. Here's the thing to notice about this. This is called the acromion process. It sticks out on top of your arm bone, your humerus, right? So what happens is when we're raising our arm, if you raise your arm straight out to the side, at some point this arm bone, right up here at the top edge of it, it starts to interfere with that acromion process. And this drives a lot of my coaching cues on where to keep elbows, and when we're doing military presses and overhead work, a lot of that comes from that conflict right there. We can consistently cause, it's called shoulder impingement syndrome, by just moving the arm in kind of the wrong way. And there's some stuff in this space, right in this up space between the acromion process and the top of the joint, top of the ball. There's a muscle, the supraspinatus, part of the rotator cuff. There's some nerves, vessels. There's stuff in there that's important, and it gets mad if it gets smashed between those two bones. Short version of that. So now we're looking at rotator cuff from the front and the back. These are muscles whose job it is to hold that big ball on the socket, right? So you can tell from this that joint is pretty easy to dislocate, right? Mechanically, it's not a very stable joint. The socket does not completely encapsulate and trap that ball. So in order to hold itself together, our body's got a bunch of muscles, rotator cuff, and the thing to notice about these is that they don't have anything to do with our rib cage or the rest of our skeleton. They don't attach to the spine. They're just attached the arm to the shoulder blade, right? So if you've been injured, shoulder injury, and you go get some physical therapy, often the PT will give us some rotator cuff exercises to do. And at the end of your treatment session, you go back to paddling your kayak or climbing your mountains or whatever it was you did that hurt your shoulder in the first place. And that doesn't make sense. I can't pull my kayak through the water with these rotator cuff muscles. They don't connect to the rest of the body, right? So there's no way to transmit a load here from the arms, say from a paddle in your hand, through your shoulder, to your rib cage, to your spine, down to your butt if you're sitting in a kayak. These muscles don't do that, and they're not supposed to do it. Their job is to hold that joint together, and that's all they do. So while strengthening them is important, it's not enough for athletic activity, right? We have to do it when you get hurt, for sure, but we got to do something else for athletic activity. So This picture came out weird, but looking at, again, you can see the muscles of the rotator cuff, and there's really no connection here to the rest of the skeleton. Yeah, it's a little bit hard to see in this angle, but that stuff is floating. Okay, moving forward here. Now, I want to point out some muscles here that most folks have never thought of. Underneath your lats, so we're looking at the back of a body here, and right along this kind of vertical line here is where the spine would be, and up in this area where I'm waving my cursor is where the skull would be. And so we're looking, we can't see the person's rib cage, but it's in front of everything we see here. So these little finger-like muscles below and in front of the shoulder blade connect, they go under the shoulder blade and they connect to this medial edge, the edge closest to the spine, closest to your center line. So we can't see part of them. They run underneath, in front of that shoulder blade. When you're watching somebody do a push-up and you see the edge of this medial edge of the shoulder blade lift up, called winging out, if your shoulder blade wings out, what we're seeing is that these muscles, these are called serratus anterior, the ones that look like fingers, serratus. And then these other guys are rhomboid, serratus posterior, levator scapulae, muscles that attach this inside edge of the shoulder blade. They hold it down. So you can imagine the shoulder blade now, it floats all around. It does not have a bony connection. And one of the major tools for connecting loads through the shoulder to the rest of the skeleton is these muscles here. And normally we can't even see these things. They're underneath other layers of muscle, which we'll see in just a moment. Here's looking at this from the front. Here's what I was trying to explain or show before. Right here where I'm waving my cursor is where the rib cage would be, spine right along here, skull up here. And you can see these finger-like muscles attached to ribs, each one, and they come along underneath the shoulder blade and attach to the inside edge here, and then continue, if you will. Technically it's a different muscle, but the line of connection continues along then to the spine. These guys are super important for setting the shoulder blade. This is how you keep your shoulder from winging out. Here's looking at, it's kind of highlighted a little more in situ here. You can see these rhomboids, levator scapulae, serratus posterior are connecting, again, this edge of the shoulder blade to the spine. There's a couple of key points I want to make here. Here's one shot, the first shot I've shown of a lat. Look where that lat attaches. It doesn't even attach to the shoulder blade at all. Let me see if the next slide. This is back to serratus anterior and this serratus posterior rhomboid muscle stuff. Back to this shot, lats. Lats are a big muscle. When we think of shoulder strength training, we think of training lats, deltoids, pecs, traps maybe, big superficial muscles, right? Big muscles that we can see, we can feel them, we can reach out and grab them, you can see them in other people, and we're pretty good at feeling them in our own body, feeling if they're engaged. You can be listening to me yak here and you can pull your shoulder down, pull your arm down and engage your lat and feel this whole big muscle flex here, this whole thing flex. But check out the shoulder blade. That thing is free to move, right? With regard to the lat, like, it has nothing to do with the shoulder blade. So the point is, you can have your shoulder blades in the wrong position. They can be winging out, they can be floating up, they can be up too high, like you're shrugging. The skill of setting or turning on, engaging your shoulder blades and holding them where they belong is separate to the skill of training the big muscles we train when we train shoulders, right? Learning to use these is a completely different skill set. And the takeaway here is that you can do anything, any shoulder training movement we do, we're free to do it wrong. And the problem with that is that it works until it stops working, right? So if you're having recurring shoulder pain, sometimes there's damage that has to heal, right? So if you've got inflammation, if you have something torn, something's angry, then now we have another layer of trouble. You have to let that heal. So, we follow our medical advice, follow our PT's advice on that. But even after it heals, we go back to training. If we keep moving incorrectly, the problem is likely to come back. And, this story of doing some kind of training, whether it's outdoors, athletic, whether it's throwing, paddling is a great, people that here in the Northwest, folks paddle kayaks a lot and stand-up paddle boards and stuff like that. And rotator cuff injuries are common because, again, the big muscles, let me jump ahead here. Here, we're looking at lats. We're looking at from the back of a body, lats, and you can see the back side of pecs here. I think, here's the same view from the front. Pecs and lats, classic shoulder strength muscles. And as you can see, they attach to the upper arm bone. They have nothing to do with the shoulder blade. So you can bench press incorrectly, you can dip incorrectly, and you can get strong at it. You can be quite strong at bench pressing until your shoulder joint is damaged because you weren't setting the shoulder blade correctly. All right, so this is a big deal. And here's a quick takeaway. Here I'm showing those two same big muscles with the shoulder blade. Here's a quick takeaway from this. Our training needs to spend some time focused on not just training is, the big classic shoulder strength moves, but we have to spend some time working on scapular stability, shoulder blade stability, putting our shoulder blade in the right place and holding that thing there, even or especially if that limits what we can do. Now we can kind of see, just to wrap this up here real quick, there's those stabilizer muscles underneath, serratus anterior, we can barely make out, kind of tucked underneath the lats. Again, we're looking from the back of a person here. Rhomboids from the back, and normally traps, these big thick muscles overlay that. There we see that. Traps are covered on top. The traps are the one exception to what I'm saying. They are a big superficial muscle that we train a lot, and they also do play a role in stabilizing shoulder blades. Normally, the upper part of the trap here is way too active in people, and the mid and lower part of the trap, these fibers that are running down and across, we're not very good at using those. So in my training cycles, I program in lots of horizontal pulling, ring rows, horizontal rows, bent over rows, things like that. And this is just one last view here, kind of lats, pecs, delts, arm muscles, and just another take here on you can't. These big muscles that we think of shoulder strength don't have anything to do with the shoulder blade. So last thought. Learning to stabilize our shoulder blade is a skill that has to be practiced. It can be practiced at the same time, but you have to have kind of a separate independent focus on shoulder blade stability. This is just kind of a couple more anatomy shots there. All right. There's more to say about how the abs play a role in all of this, but for now, I'm going to wrap that up. So, Mark, you got another question?
Yes, it's if you still have time, it's still related to posterior pelvic tilt.
Yes.
And so it's a three-parter. In fact, so the first part is the sound okay, by the way? Is my microphone okay?
Yes, I can hear you, yeah.
Okay. So is that posterior pelvic tilt possibly also an issue with deadlifts?
Yes.
At the bottom, it is. Okay.
It can be if you're typically, folks feel that as tight hamstrings. So if you press yourself back, push your butt back, feel the tension engage in your spinal erectors, glutes, and hamstrings. There's an art and a skill to keeping all that engaged and maintaining the neutral spine. So posterior tilt there looks just like rounding your low back, which is kind of a disaster when we're deadlifting. Like, that's absolutely not what we want to practice. It comes down to the same thing, learning to really set your trunk. Learn to feel and maintain that neutral spine. This can, again, video is our friend here. You can set up a phone or get somebody to film you while you're moving. Film from the side so that you can see, with maybe some fairly tight fitting shirts, so you can see your trunk shape. As you take a breath, hold that breath, bear down, and start to really pressurize your abs. You should look from the side as though you haven't moved at all. You're just standing there. We may see your chest rise and fall a little as you take that breath and hold it and bear down, but at the end of that process, you're just standing up tall, neutral spine. So that's how to start learning to feel it, and then you have to be really diligent about it while you're lifting. So, as you pull yourself down to grab the bar, as you're moving up and down with the deadlift, just be super diligent, and that becomes the thing that, one, determines whether the load is okay or not, right? Not can you stand it up, because we can stand up with way more than we should, which again works until it doesn't, and then all of a sudden we're broken. So maintaining that neutral spine, that really is the crux of deadlifting well. And a lot of it comes down to practicing that. Most people aren't so tight in the hamstrings that they can't deadlift right. I've known a few, but usually that's not actually the case, even though that's what it feels like. It's a matter of learning to keep the trunk engaged, which in turn keeps your hamstrings engaged, which is actually a good thing. Our quads often try to take over on the deadlift as well. So you said there was a couple parts.
Yeah, so basically it was an issue today, as you said, for me, because it was deadlift in your program. So my second part of the question is it possible, same way as the squat, that a rack pull would be beneficial if I start from not the ground, but from a little bit higher up, to learn that first?
Yes, there's two ways to do that. One, just elevate the weights on some kind of plate or box, so that essentially a rack pull, or take the bar out of the rack, maybe deadlift it out of the rack, take one step back. And so now essentially you're starting your movements from the top, and pull yourself into the deadlift as deeply as you can without losing that neutral spine, which might not be all the way to the floor, and do your reps there. That is a tool that I use a lot with people who can't quite take it off the floor. So that's a good think of that as approaching the movement from the top down. And that can be a really good way to retrain that. Yeah.
Great. And so the third part of the question, it hurts now, basically. So I found out, not 5 to 10 minutes after doing the deadlift, like, okay, it was not that heavy, but something's wrong. So what to do when you are injured? Should I stop training, or take 2 or 3 days rest, or what do you suggest?
Rest is not usually the answer, but so in a scenario like you described, it didn't sound like you had a disaster and fell over moaning in pain in the gym, correct?
No. It's just
but
like 5 to 10 minutes.
You realized, oops, That was a little much. That's probably best not classified as an injury. Injury implies that some kind of damage was done, like some torn tissue or something moved, or probably none of that happened. What you have, though, is you were moving with some not enough stability in that area. So that kind of threatens your body, threatens your nervous system, threatens your well-being. So your body tries to protect itself by essentially panicking and spasming some muscles, and that hurts, right? But the muscles are spasmed not because they're damaged, but because they're trying to protect you, right? They don't know. Something weird was going on. These loads were really strange feeling. We don't like this. We're going to panic until this stops, right? That's kind of a anthropomorphic way to talk
Sounds
about
right.
it.
Sounds right on my end.
So the takeaway there is if you just try to relax, like you get a massage or you take an Epsom salts bath or you rest for a few days, you try to relax those muscles. That's a common sense reaction to panicky spasm muscles, try to relax them. And it tends to not work. Or if it works temporarily and then the problem comes roaring back. Because those guys panicked for a reason. They're trying to protect you. So making them loose again doesn't help. But here's what does help. Go to the MoveSKILL, our MoveSKILL.com website, and look in the movement library. And I think we have an ab mat sit-up. We don't have an ab mat sit-up. Do I have a low back pain video? What was that video called? I'm asking Nancy here.
We'll send it out later. I don't remember.
There's a video. I'm going to have to dig up the name of it because I didn't expect this question. But there's a video on back pain, understanding back pain, something like that. If you go to our movement library and search for back pain, you'll find it. But we'll also post this here as soon as we can.
Okay, thank you.
I go into some real detail. Essentially, it's carefully train your abs. So think crunches, Mark. You're gonna squeeze your abs and do some crunches. We're trying to train your abdominal muscles without pulling on your hip flexors, right? So it's not sit-ups. It's like 80s crunches. And that's kind of without being able to look at the video. That's kind of, I think, as good as I'm going to be able to say right now. But here's a quick takeaway on this. If you can do there's a fine line. If you train your abs incorrectly right now, it makes this problem worse because it kind of tugs on your spine more, and that's the last thing your body wants to feel right now. But if you train your abs correctly, which means doing it without tugging on your spine, you can often turn this problem off in a matter of minutes and fix it, right? Because again, there's almost certainly there's no actual damage. It's just your body's warning you to whatever it was you were just doing, please stop that, right? That's what's going on. So take away from there, let's look for that video, and I'm going to try to, where can we post that? I'll figure out where to post this and put that up as quick as I can here.
Thank you. That's great advice. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I think that's going to wrap up this first of our bi-monthly group chats. If some folks are listening to this later and you want to get some questions in, you can shoot that at info@moveskill.com or dave@moveskill.com. Just fire those questions at us and we'll get to them next time. So thank you, and catch you guys later.